I'm delighted to be here. This has been such a fabulous session and symposium and so many great talks. I'm going to take a little bit of a broader view about science and religion to kind of put this evolution and religion conversation in a little more context and help us think about some of the ways that how we approach it in the evolution realm can also have ripple effects elsewhere. So, of course, people often talk about science versus religion. I'm just going to say here that my goal is to hopefully help you think about science and religion. Now, this doesn't necessarily mean that you have to think these things are equally important in your own life or in the world or equally of value, but I think what we need to remember is that we do need to engage both of these in dialogue. So, this is, of course, how most people see the relationship between science and religion, right? We are often hear about the conflict between science and religion, of course, on full view at the Scopes trial and continuing today. We know it didn't start with Scopes, right? Everybody's heard about Galileo and all like that. This is, since time immemorial, science and religion have been at war with one another. Except that's not really the case. For most of history, in fact, religious communities were very involved in the development of science. And lots of the science that we talk about, that we've been talking about here, had some of its origins in religious communities or with religious scientists. Of course, Mendel was a monk when he was tinkering around with pea plants. We currently have several, Francis Collins' name has come up several times. People like Catherine Hayhoe in climate science, who is an evangelical Christian. Kizzmekia Corbett, who was central to the development of the COVID vaccine, is a faithful Baptist. So there are people of faith in the sciences, of course. And yet, you know, most people say that science and religion are in conflict. So this study is from about 10 years ago. I will talk about some more recent work as well. But in 2015, Pew Research did a survey about science and society, and they asked people generally, do you think science and religion are often in conflict? So generally, are they often in conflict? And almost 60% of people said yes. Okay, so this is a problem because the US public is highly religious. So from 2025, now, if you are in the religion realm, this looks horrifying because of this big wedge right here of what we call the nuns, not N-U-N-S, N-O-N-E-S. But even though religiosity among US adults has in fact been dropping, this year, 69% of US adults identify as a particular religious affiliation. I will also point out that among that 19% that are religiously unaffiliated, most of those people profess some sort of belief in God. Many of them engage in what we would consider religious practices like prayer, but they do not consider themselves affiliated with a particular religious tradition. So this may also include people who say they're spiritual but not religious. You will note that this survey lumped together atheist and agnostic, which is, I think, a flaw in their methodology, but and then 1% of people just don't know, which I think is fun. I don't know if I'm religious or not. But the problem that this indicates is that if science and religion are often in conflict, then we're in a heap of trouble as scientists, okay? Because all of a sudden, at least 70% of the US public is in conflict with the things that we are trying to promote and teach. And in fact, even though, however, that as a public, we generally say that science and religion are often in conflict, people of faith don't actually experience this in their individual lives. So this survey then asked people who took the survey, who identified as themselves people of faith, does science sometimes, not even often or generally, does science sometimes conflict with your own religious beliefs? Only 30% of people said yes. So why is this happening? Why do people think that science and religion are often in conflict, even if they personally aren't experiencing that in their own lives? Well, there are a lot of things going on here, and I will confess, I am not a historian of science or religion, but there are some very specific political and cultural factors that play into this. And a lot of it has to do, can kind of trace back to two books written in the late 1800s. And now in the 1800s was when science became its own sort of profession, and when people were trying to kind of separate out science from other areas of academy. And in 1874, John William Draper, who was the first president of the American Chemical Society, wrote History of the Conflict Between Science and Religion. And then in 1896, Andrew Dickson White, who was the first president of Cornell University, wrote A History of the Warfare of Science with Theology in Christendom. Okay? Now, neither one of these books were very good history. They were really driven by the sort of political and cultural motivations of their authors, but they have become a very outsized influence in the way that we think about science and religion. They have become the dominant understanding. Even if I don't experience this, clearly there is a conflict. There is a war. And in our increasingly polarized society, this kind of thing is only going to get worse if we continue to play into this cultural narrative. There's kind of a positive feedback loop here. If people hear that science and religion are in conflict, even if they don't necessarily feel that themselves, they are unlikely to want to talk about that with other people because they don't want to start a fight. And if we don't hear about people who don't think that science and religion are in conflict in their own lives, then we are going to continue to believe that somehow in the ether, science and religion are just by nature in conflict with each other. So an alternative approach that many people kind of take in this sort of context is Stephen Jay Gould's non-overlapping magisteria, right? Science is over here, religion is over here. We just don't have to talk about, they don't relate to each other. They're completely different things. Often people will say, oh, science answers the how and religion answers the why, which is somewhat helpful in thinking about different approaches to ways of knowing, but also I think is an oversimplification that is really doing a disservice both to science and religion and to reality, because it doesn't actually reflect the way that people really live. There are, in fact, a ton of intersections of science and religion that are important for us to think about. Now, when we think about places that science and religion intersect in one way or another, a lot of times what leaps to mind, of course, is the sort of philosophical interaction that these are, and when we talk about it from a conflict narrative, people will say, well, they're just two fundamentally different ways of looking at the world, right? You've got a concrete, logical, evidence-based approach of science, and you've got an emotional, faith-based approach of religion. And if you take one of those viewpoints, you can't take the other viewpoint. There are a small subset of fundamentalists on either side that maybe take this approach, but in reality, that's a very small, albeit loud, proportion of the population. I mean, let's face it, humans don't actually work this way. Jamie was talking about mental gymnastics in evolution acceptance, but in fact, we do this all the time in our lives. There are lots of things that if you drill down into it, it would not necessarily follow a specifically scientific way of understanding or even a specifically religious way of understanding. There are, lots of ways that philosophically these two fields overlap. I like this graphic showing us ways of overlap, right? Science and religion, they both search for answers. They both have strict laws and practices. They both involve lectures and big, heavy books. There's long coats or long robes. They both blow stuff up. So really the only thing is that science says God is man-made and religion says man is God-made. Otherwise, they're almost exactly the same. But, if you're talking about the way that people actually work and the way that they approach the world, philosophically, there are many places where conversation between science and religion actually deepens our understanding of the world. I'm going to talk about some resources that my organization has, and I'm going to quote Sean Carroll from one of our videos, because he says, I think the discussion that's really interesting between religious thinkers and scientists is getting over this question of did evolution really happen? The more interesting question is how we should think about the role of humanity, the role of individual lives, and our meaning and purpose here in light of evolution, in light of our evolutionary history. You can't have those kinds of conversations, of course, if you say science and religion are completely separate, non-overlapping magisteria, and we can't talk about these things. And of course, there are other ways that science and religion intersect and impact each other. Logistically, there was, in the history of the Scopes trial, or somebody talked about the technological advances and savvy of the fundamentalist preachers. And we find this today, Technology and science inform how people do religious practices. And religion impacts the way we do science, even on a very logistical level. We probably wouldn't be working today if we weren't at this conference because it's Sunday, right? Why do you think we have Sundays off in the work week? That's a religious impact on the logistics of how we do science. Practically is a big one, right? What is funded and supported in science is driven by politics and priorities that are often influenced, at least somewhat, by religious worldviews. There's also impacts on who is doing science. This is really important because when we think about science, we like to believe that we are completely objective and rational and everything like that, but we have a long history of not having everybody at the table, not allowing people to do science. There used to be rations or restrictions on how many Jews could be hired in a science department at universities or just overall at a university, right? And many of the populations that even today are underrepresented in the sciences are populations for whom religious identity is an important part of their culture. This includes Black and Hispanic populations, it includes women, it includes rural populations. We lose out on those voices in science if we continue to propagate this narrative that there is an inherent conflict and people of faith are not welcome in the sciences. And on the other side of things, religion is impacted in interesting ways by science. Who is doing religion is impacted by science. You saw that big wedge of nuns. That wedge has been growing and growing, and one of the things that people identify as something that has caused them to leave a religious community is because they don't think their religious community supports science, and they're seeing conflicts between what they're hearing in their religious community and what they are seeing in the wider world, what they're seeing from scientific evidence. And actually, religious research and work is impacted by science. The Lilly Endowment is a huge funder of theological education in our in our world, and you know where the lily money comes from, right? Pharmaceuticals. So. And ethically, of course, there's a big intersection here. Science shapes the way that people of faith make ethical decisions and advocate about ethical issues, whether that's things around healthcare and healing, whether it's things about food security or environmental justice. These are areas that faith communities are very active in, and they can and should be impacted and informed by science. And science needs to hear from people of faith and other people who are engaged in ethical and moral conversations about how we do and apply science. Because science, it hasn't always looked super rosy. Okay, this graphic on the left is a map of places where eugenics sterilization legislation was in place in the United States. These are states in which people could be sterilized based on eugenic principles. And of course, most of us, I think, have heard of the Tuskegee study that unethically did not treat African American men who were infected with syphilis in order to study the effects of syphilis. It just did not provide them treatment. J. Marion Sims, who is seen as the father of modern gynecology, operated on enslaved women without consent or without anesthesia. And of course, as we mentioned, we have an underrepresentation still of minority and low-income students in STEM programs. And these are not things that are just in the past. Injustice creeps into applications of science. So there was a study that found that racial science was baked into artificial intelligence algorithms that were meant to help doctors treat patients. And it wasn't because of bias on the part of the programmers, but in fact on the data sets that they were using, because the data was based on spending on treatment and guessing who would have a particular condition based on the history of spending in those populations to treat people in the past who've had that condition. Well, guess what? Medical spending in African American populations and Black populations is less for the same disease, for the same problem. And so the result of that was then they would get diagnosed less by this AI algorithm that was based on those data. And we also know that we have moral and ethical issues with the ways that we treat human remains, that we decide what populations we are going to include in studies. So people of faith can and must provide moral and ethical guidance to the scientific community. So we need to be in conversation with each other. And we don't do ourselves any favors when we play into this conflict narrative. So I mentioned that Pew had done a more recent study. In 2025, Pew's study actually showed that the overall level of people who say that religion and science are mostly in conflict has actually dropped. It's now only 50%. Now, unfortunately, they didn't ask the same question about personal experience, so we don't have that data point. But they did break it down by level of religious commitment, and as Jamie pointed out in her talk, the people with the highest level of religious commitment actually saw the lowest level of thinking there's a conflict between science and religion. Meanwhile, people who had low levels or no levels of religiosity was as high as 73% said that there was a conflict between science and religion. So the call is coming from inside the house. And there are deep challenges to this. I don't want to downplay the real problems that we face. I don't want to downplay all of the things that we've been talking about today. But we also need to be aware of what we can do in these situations. Let's face it, there is a lot of contempt and dismissal of people who have different viewpoints of us. There's a lot of fear about talking about this too, fear of backlash and reactions of other people. There's a lot of isolation too. So let me tell you a little bit about my own story. I have a PhD in ecology and evolution. I studied at Stony Brook University. I did my work on the development of the relationship, the mutualism between agave palmeri. It's one of the agaves that's closely related to agave tequiliana. And it's pollinating bats. So I studied bat pollination. And I worked for a time with the Arizona Game and Fish Department as their bat biologist. And then I went to seminary. And I got my Master of Divinity degree from Candler School of Theology at Emory University. I was ordained in the United Methodist Church, and I served as a church pastor for 9 years until I came to AAAS. Now, I got to tell you, I'm a little nervous talking about that in this room. And I'm really grateful for Jamie going ahead of me, and I'm curious how many of you thought her story about growing up in the LDS church was just going to be about that, growing up in the LDS church, but not being in the church anymore. People of faith among the sciences often feel isolated, and they feel like they can't bring up that part of their life because they might be rejected or dismissed by their colleagues. So I work for AAAS, the American Association for the Advancement of Science. It's the world's largest general scientific membership society and publisher of the Science family of journals, Science being the most important scientific publication in the world, Ken Miller. Nature, come on. But also, I will tout AAAS because it is the only nonprofit publisher, and we have a nonprofit set of programs that advance our mission of advancing science, engineering, and innovation throughout the world for the benefit of all. And 30 years ago, AAAS realized that engaging in these questions of science and ethics and religion was important enough to start its own program. So the Dialogue on Science, Ethics, and Religion, our goal is to foster dialogue and engagement about science and technology and society between scientific and religious communities, recognizing that these communities often overlap. We have a number of programs that we do. One of our most successful is our Science for Seminaries program that brings science engagement into the training of future faith leaders, and in fact into their core curriculum, so that people who are training to become rabbis or pastors or other faith leaders get science engagement in their training so that they understand how this might intersect with what they are doing in their congregations. We also do a lot of training for scientists to help them feel more comfortable and equipped to speak with audiences of faith. And this is important because we've talked a lot about trust in science and the fact that everybody, here's the quote that I wrote down from Ken Miller, now that I had called him out about the nature comment. I will quote you. Every single citizen in this country has a role to play in supporting science education. So that means we need to be equipped and empowered to talk to all kinds of people about this, not just the folks that we meet in our scientific circles. And we also know, though, that facts are not enough, okay? We need to think about what trust is. We need to realize that we don't deserve trust just because we are part of the scientific enterprise, okay? Science is not inherently deserving of trust. Remember about eugenics and those other things that I brought up? So we need to be aware of where mistrust is coming from, where it is justified, and we need to be held accountable. And we also need to be open to hearing from people about what is kind of motivating, if they don't trust science, what's motivating that? and not to make assumptions about it. And trust is often built on personal connection. So with our Science for Seminaries program, it wasn't just about bringing science content into seminaries. We brought scientists into seminaries so that the students were meeting scientists and getting to know them as people. And, Gail Sinatra talked a lot about in-group identity and people wanting to hear from folks who share aspects of their identity. That doesn't mean, it could be super important if you're talking to religious communities if you do share their religious identity, but it doesn't have to be that. It can be all other kinds of identity, whether that's cultural identity, whether it's regional, just people like to hear from people who are closer to them than, experts from across the country. And so I want to share just some bullet points of what we try to do in our workshops with scientists, and there are 3, and hopefully you can remember them, okay? The first is be strategic about engaging. What is your goal? Now, this is going to be very different for different situations, whether you're having a one-time interaction with somebody or whether this is a student in your classroom or somebody else that you'll have a long relationship with. But can I suggest an underlying goal of inspiring greater curiosity and learning in the people that you are talking to? Or as Paul Turner put it, getting people hooked on learning about this stuff. Contextualization is really important here too, thinking about what's important to people that you're talking to and what they will resonate with. This was another big part of the work that we did in seminaries, is letting the seminaries say, these are the topics that our students are going to be tackling in their congregations. This is what we want them to engage with, which meant that not every seminary talked about evolution. Sorry. Some of them talked about neurobiology. Some of them talked about cosmology, all kinds of different things. And also to recognize that you may not always be the right messenger or the only messenger. And so looking for allies, finding folks that can help with whatever engagement you're trying to do. And recognize, too, that you don't have to have all the answers, okay? This whole question about, offering perspectives on how people bring compatibility and congruence to religious and scientific perspectives. You don't have to be able to answer all of those questions. It's okay to leave that to the theologians. But you can also find allies in the theologians. So be strategic, be respectful. We've heard this a lot, right? The importance of humility. We need to be aware of our own assumptions, okay? We have this tendency to paint religion with a big brush, right? Okay? If you hear Richard Dawkins talking about the God that he doesn't believe in, well, guess what? I don't believe in that God either, and I'm a United Methodist pastor, okay? So, religion is not at all a monolith. And so when we make assumptions about why people might find some sort of internal conflict or mistrust or whatever with science, then we are really going to run into problems. So we need to have that humility, that intellectual humility. We need to ask questions. We need to be curious, okay? We're scientists. We should be good at that. And the last one is be human, okay? This sounds hopefully obvious, but helping to find those areas of common value and experience, like Amanda talked about, her own experience of people being able to resonate with her and not have, not push back against what she was teaching because she shared their experience. And there's studies that show that religious audiences' trust in science is lower than other communities, and it's directly correlated with their view of scientists as people with moral character. So that's not to say that they think that scientists are immoral people, but they don't see scientists as people of a particular moral character. They don't know why we do science. They don't know what motivates us or what ethics we're using to decide what to do. Talk about those things. They don't have to be religiously based to talk about beauty and innovation and awe and wonder and curiosity, the things that motivate us in our science, will help people to resonate with what they're doing. I loved that the letter from Monod to the kid who asked him, because he was just willing to talk about what inspired and drove him in his science. And one thing we always try to emphasize is, to paraphrase Maya Angelou, people don't always remember what you say, but they remember how you made them feel. If you make people feel stupid, they aren't gonna wanna listen to you. If you make them feel welcome and excited, you may not get them to completely accept evolution, but they will be more open to continuing the conversation and continuing the interaction. We have a lot of great resources on our website, sciencereligion.dialogue.org. A number of film series, the one I mentioned that features Sean Carroll. We've got one called Science the Wide Angle that's got a great video about Draper White, the Draper White conflict, and also a lot of other ones. We have a series called Who is Science that sort of highlights stories of scientists and what motivates them. We have a short series on becoming human that just talks about human evolution, and then a great series on humans and race that features this. Most of our videos are like 5 to 8 minutes long. Science's Mastery is about 30 minutes long. It talks about how science and religion both have been used to justify racist policies in the US, so it's a really powerful film. We also have these great profiles that we do of folks, scientists engaging with religious communities. Here's one of Liz Barnes, who you're going to hear next. We got one of Rick Potts, who Smithsonian, and also I want to highlight the work of Michael Zimmerman, who leads the Clergy Letter Project, which is a group of clergy who support the teaching of evolution and support evolution science. And also our workshops that we do for scientists where we delve into those. But again, be strategic, be respectful, be human. Okay, you've got the workshop now. So thank you so much.